Welcome to episode number 8 of the Men and Community podcast. On today's episode, Matt and Carlo gingerly tackle toxic masculinity. Matt sheds light on how the male advantage is a gift we didn't really ask for. Carlo explores how not everyone falls under the same umbrella, and we share ideas on how to grow and expand our mindsets. Thank you for being part of our community. All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Men and Community podcast. This is Matt. I'm Carlo. Super excited to have you here. I'm doing the intro today, not Matt. Not for any particular reason other than I wanted to do it.
I've been informed that I've been doing them a lot, and we're all about equity here.
Yeah, and there's nothing wrong with one of us doing it. I just thought I would do it.
Love it.
So I hope it was up to the standards that you've come to be accustomed to from Matt introducing us.
Hopefully better. Let's set that bar high.
That's right. It's an improvement game. We're always trying to get a little bit better. So we are super excited to have you guys here with us again today. As always, it's a beautiful sunny day. We're excited to have some great chats. We've got an interesting topic that we're going to let Matt lead us into today, and we're going to dive into. And again, it's going to be one of those ones that I think we're going to, just scratch the surface of today, but we have some really cool ideas moving forward of how we want to continue chatting on some of these subjects. So why don't we, in great Mac fashion, start with our cards that you have stacked the deck with.
I haven't. I actually shuffled in many more cards, so it's much more randomized than usual.
See you when I believe it.
Okay. If one of your friends needed to move in for a year, who would you like it to be? Well, now it's just awkward if I don't say you, right?
I gotta be fine.
I actually, you would be the top of the list, certainly. Mm-hmm. You're very, very independent. Your ability to be a contributor to a household in terms of like cooking and all these sorts of things would make you very near the top of the list. As it turns out, I also have a couple of other friends who are quite talented in the kitchen. And so I think the two of them, both Kai and Terry, I think of, who both in their own rights are very talented in the kitchen, that wouldn't be terrible roommates either. Although all three of you have pitfalls, but overall you wouldn't be terrible roommates.
Yeah, I think that's every roommate. As much as a roommate can be a great roommate, there's always going to be one thing or another you don't agree upon or run your lives a little bit differently. I do find it very interesting how focused around food that felt. So you heard it here, folks. If you can't cook, you can never move in with Matt. At least not as a guy. I don't know if it's different.
It is what it is.
Yeah, for me, you'd be top of the list for sure. And it's super intriguing because when I was younger, I remember having conversations with a whole bunch of high school friends that, one of us was going to buy a house and then we were all going to move in together and have this big frat house parties and, have this great time together. And then, of course, it never happened because then you realize those people that you love to party with sometimes and are great friends wouldn't be good roommates.
Because you love partying at certain times, but you like to be able to stop the party.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not time to party, it's time to clean up after the party, right? And like you said, I contribute to a household pretty well, but I also have a set of standards in my house. And it doesn't matter whether, let's say you and I were both to go and 50-50 buy a house, and arguably it's both of our house, I would still have this set of standards that I would want you to keep to, just like I would keep to yours.
Sure.
Right? And when people, those expectations aren't clear or they're not set early enough, I think that's where a lot of the roommate things happen. So, yeah, I think you'd be the top of the list. I have a couple other friends, but I also really enjoy living alone. My roommate moved out about a month ago now. So I've been on my own for about a month, and it's been really, really nice. So yeah, I am independent, and I kind of like that.
See, I haven't lived on my own for 5 or 6 years now, and there's times when I miss it, but it's also nice to have the companionship of a roommate.
Yeah, I do miss my old roommate a lot. So shout outs to you, Brandy. But I think there's advantages and disadvantages to both.
Like anything else.
All right. Stacked deck. What For Dummies book have you read? Like, I've never read one. I think they're a kind of a cool concept. For those that don't know, there are a series of books for
Dummies.
For dummies, but it's basically a explain to me like I'm 5 years old this concept, and they range all sorts of things from finance to programming to website design. Like, there's thousands of them. And I think it's a really cool resource for people that want to learn. I think it's less popular now than it was before, just because we have things like YouTube and all that kind of stuff. But I've never read one, purely because I feel like my learning process is less of a let me take a class, course, or read a book on this entire concept,
right,
and then go implement it. It's more of a let me take a small 15-20 minute class or YouTube video, try that thing, and then move on to the next one. So I'm a very learn by doing kind of person. So these never really were important to me.
I can't think of one that I've read all the way through. I've certainly picked up a few, contemplated it, put them down, or like every book that I think I'm going to read, I read the first 5 pages and then I leave it be. The two that are coming up for me right now, the first one would be Spanish for Dummies. We of course traveled recently to a Spanish-speaking country, and so I Duolingo all the time, but having a book that's a little bit more of a language manuscript it would be useful, albeit I didn't go very far in the book. And then the other one, which is way more specific, is Robert's Rules for Dummies. And for those of you listening, Carlo's giving me I almost called you Robert. Carlo's giving me this look as though most of you are probably giving, like, what on earth are Robert's Rules? Well, Robert's Rules is the largely agreed upon standard for parliamentary procedure. These are things like motions and I second that and I motion that we do this and now we vote on it. Like, those sorts of procedures that coincide with super formal meetings.
Sure.
Robert's Rules is one of those things that I would be happy to dive into. I'm on a board of directors for an organization that is currently going through incorporation. So right now, as a board, we're exploring, are we going to use Robert's Rules? Is there an alternative? And so I'm trying to, off the side of my desk, learn Robert's Rules of Order, at least so much as I can, to be a useful resource to the rest of the board.
And I think that's the coolest thing about learning, is that sometimes you have this opportunity to just explore or expand upon a existing skill set with a new skill set that complements each other. Yeah. That's the coolest thing to me. Yeah. So that's neat.
Yeah.
And you found value in that book as opposed to other types of learning?
Well, now let me preface that by saying when I was on Amazon looking at this, I seriously considered buying Robert's Rules, the Dummies, Robert's Rules for Dummies, and even read the first few pages of the preview that it allows in Amazon. Decided on actually buying the proper handbook, the original Robert's Rules of Order.
Sure.
Figured it would be a nice resource to have the actual thing.
Yeah, like I feel like the Dummies books probably have like a general scope of most of the concept.
Yeah.
But it's explained in a way that, like, if you really are starting from square one, that's where you would start. But if you already have some knowledge in these aspects, you wouldn't need a book like that.
True.
Right?
Very, very true.
Yeah.
All right, let's jump in. So this one, for me, has felt like the elephant in the room ever since we started even thinking about a podcast.
Sure.
And as Carlo mentioned, we're going to really, really scratch the surface today, but I want to talk about toxic masculinity.
Whew.
And, you know, it's something that the minute that we named our podcast, people would kind of look at us and cock their heads to the side and say, well, why does your podcast just need to be about men? And so it's just, I want to start having this conversation about toxic masculinity, the role it plays, how we interpret it, things like that, and just start getting into it. And one of the reasons this came up, you know, like I said, we had all of these, I don't know, call it trepidations, I guess, about
hesitancies.
About a podcast focused around men and their role in community. And we were worried that people might perceive us to be, misogynistic. These were all these sorts of words and fears going through my head, certainly. And then they were reinforced very, very quickly. The first video that we posted on Instagram promoting the release of the new
our podcast trailer.
Somebody who is very much an arm's length acquaintance posted or a comment saying, "Men ain't shit." This is a person that I've maybe met twice, a friend of a friend who I haven't communicated with in any way for 5, 6, 7 years, something like that. And I don't know where it came from, but I think what it does tell me, whether or not it's a joke, because to give this person the benefit of the doubt, maybe it was a joke, maybe this was something that was supposed to be funny, but I think it really highlights how sensitive we've become to this idea of masculinity being toxic.
Sure. And, it was one of those things that when we saw the comment, we both kind of had our own ways of trying to address it. I immediately wanted to reach out to this person and, have a conversation with them about why they felt it was necessary to post this. Because like Matt said, at arm's length, this relationship. So it's possible that this person was going through a hard time. And if you are listening to this...
which I would be shocked.
Yeah, but if you are... give us the benefit of the doubt on this episode, because by no means will this episode be about this comment. It's more about the wrapper that this comment is inside of. Yeah. So I wanted to immediately jump in and talk to this person and see why this would be something that she would want to say, because of course there is that dynamic of this was a female saying this about men. And it wasn't that, well, I don't like Matt, or I don't like Carla, or I don't like the preface of the podcast itself. It's that as a whole, men are bad or of very little value, which we've talked about in other episodes, right? So that topic in itself is very upsetting to me. Not to say I was upset at the comment, but it's upsetting when things are said like, men ain't shit or men ain't of value. Yeah, so it's so frustrating to me when we see comments like this, because it belittles, it's an attempt to belittle all men, right? And, as a double standard that really bothers me is that it seems to be okay in today's society to try and belittle all men in a generalistic fashion and put us down, but then if the reverse were flipped, if we were to say, well, all women are terrible, and we do see a little bit of this now where we're starting to hear things like, all women are no longer traditional women, or all women, have unrealistic expectations, etc. Whatever you hear, this mass generalization, doesn't matter who it's directed to or who it's done by, is not good. And it doesn't make anybody feel good. And then, if you are the kind of person that says, well, no, I'm different, I don't fall under that generalization, nobody takes you seriously anyways, because then you're the one person trying to say, oh, no, don't worry, I'm not like all other guys, right? So it is super frustrating when we saw something like that, and to see it right at as we're launching our podcast was such an interesting thing, and it made us wonder whether we were going to get a lot of that kind of stuff. And thankfully we haven't. And not that we aren't open to receiving, comments and criticism from people, but when it feels like such an unwarranted biased attack, it just felt off. So we thought after a little while now of being established and a little bit more about what it is that we do on this podcast and the way that we speak, that now was maybe a time to broach this subject.
Yeah, and for me on a personal level and kind of an academic level, I suppose, this is something that I find really, really interesting. So just a bit of context. I have a degree in a program called Global Leadership. And among other things, one of the angles, I suppose, that the Global Leadership program that I was enrolled in really, really focused on is different ways to honor and respect different oppressed groups. This idea of intersectionality was a really, really big theme. And so intersectionality really generally is the idea that the level of privilege that you hold in society is directly attributed to how many intersectional markers you have. To say that in another way, intersectionality basically says that the most privileged people in society are straight, white, able-bodied men.
Sure.
So essentially, if that is the pinnacle of the privilege pyramid, every time you take an additional step away from straight, white, able-bodied men, you're at more of a disadvantage. You have less privilege in society, is the general idea of intersectionality. So we talked about this a lot in my program, and so what I find really, really interesting is that I think that toxic masculinity is an attempt or a movement or a social construct that is attempting to level out the playing field between the genders to try to, reestablish some more equitable power dynamics to support the amount of power and privilege that non-men experience in society.
Okay. So I like what you're saying in regards, and I agree with what you're saying in regards to why you feel it is what it is, but maybe we should define a little bit more about what we mean when we say toxic masculinity before we dive too deep into it. So when you say toxic masculinity, how would you define that from the viewpoint of another man?
Yeah, really, really good question. So I think that the way that I would define toxic masculinity is when traits that are associated with the masculine. So you think about traits like aggression, ambition, I think even, and this might be an interesting conversation, but I think even extroversion to a certain degree.
Sure.
Overconfidence, physical dominance. These are all things that are generally seen as masculine traits. And the list is much longer. But I think when we start to enter conversations about toxic masculinity is when these traits are amplified as a means of exerting control over someone else or a group of people. So somebody is using their ambition, or someone's using aggressiveness to persuade, manipulate, control, and really try to exhibit that level of dominance and power, basically reestablishing that same power dynamic from the male perspective.
Okay.
How would you describe it?
I look at it as a form of gatekeeping.
Okay, I like that. Yep.
So, and this is a good way, I think, to also describe any sort of toxicity. Is that, if you think about it in terms of masculine toxicity, it's, as you said, I'm a man, so I do a blue job, which is fixing the car. And because this is something I would describe as a masculine quality or masculine skill set, I don't believe that women are capable of doing that. When we know is not true. You can do whatever the heck you want. We all have the same human brain.
Yeah.
It is the aggressive way of basically saying, unless you fall within what I predetermine you being already qualified to do this or feel this way or do, then you're not allowed to do it.
Right.
You're not allowed to feel that way.
Right.
Right. So it's just a form of gatekeeping in whatever aspect.
And I think the term gatekeeping is a really strong affiliation to use here because, the word toxic doesn't imply that masculinity in and of itself is bad. It implies that, again, these traits are in some way being made toxic. So there is something that is, these traits are being used to ill effect. Something really interesting, and the reason, for those of you that are listening, I pulled out my phone, and for an interesting reason, I Googled earlier toxic masculinity just to see what the top results were that came up. Something fascinating. Google wants to get into the conversation. Something that I find really, really interesting is that when you Google toxic masculinity, there is a page on WebMD, which, if anybody's ever had something wrong with them and they felt the need to diagnose themselves,
which
WebMD,
don't do that.
Right, but WebMD becomes a very, very popular resource. Anyways, there's a page on WebMD dedicated to toxic masculinity. I'm going to read you a little bit of it here. It says that toxic masculinity is an attitude or a set of social guidelines stereotypically associated with manliness that often have a negative impact on men, women, and society in general. So basically what it goes on to talk about is the idea that certain behaviors that are associated with masculinity and physical toughness can then be associated with other societal, social justice issues, whether it be sexism, homophobia, transphobia, all of these sorts of things. And ultimately, they have a negative impact. What I then turned around and did immediately, because I'm like, okay, so this is interesting, because whether you're male or female, there are masculine and feminine traits, and everybody has a different degree to which they exhibit masculine and feminine traits, regardless of your gender identity. Is there such a thing as toxic femininity? Because surely, if there are certain traits that everybody has, that if you push them too far, they become toxic, surely there's ones that are feminine. And do you have a guess? I searched the web for toxic femininity. Does WebMD have a page dedicated to toxic femininity?
No, I don't think they do.
No, they don't. And I think it speaks to what you're talking about, right? This idea that we're gatekeeping these things, and we're really putting a double standard on the way that we view masculine traits as being potentially harmful, and then broadcasting that and painting all men with the same brush as a result of this.
Well, and tell me if you agree with this idea that I'm formulating in my head. You made the comment that, masculinity comes, or toxic masculinity can be kind of brought back to this idea of, as I lose my train of thought, it can be brought back to this idea of privilege. Okay. Now, it is arguable to say that male privilege has had, historically speaking, a very significantly higher level than female privilege. Right? We've been able to vote for longer. We've been able to work in whatever careers we've wanted to for longer. There hasn't been this stigma or this societal pressure for a man to be, a stay-at-home wife that there has been for women for so long.
Yep.
Right? So when I think about that, just the sheer amount of actual time that men have been able to do more of what they want to do without opposition than women have, I think now is why we are seeing so much, I don't want to say man hate, but we're seeing so much criticism directed at men.
100% agree with you.
As opposed to seeing it criticism based against women.
Well, and I think... And so this is another thing that we dealt with a lot in my program. Privilege is a construct that occurs because of the system that it's in. So the reason why men have so much privilege and power, it's because, to your point, the systems that we exist in, at least in a Western setting, are dominated by men. They're created by men. So obviously they are biased towards privileging men. So yes, there are less barriers in the way of men because they are more predetermined to be successful within a system that was created by men. So understanding that, we start to see that it's a systemic thing. So yes, without a doubt, and please, if somebody wants to argue, I would love to have you on this podcast and talk about whether or not you actually believe that women are less privileged than men, because I think that it is undoubtable for me that men experience more privilege than women. And it's because of those systemic things. What I find to be where we start to stray into a place that is not constructive is when we make that men's fault.
Yes.
You and I are in our early 30s. We did not create the systems that now benefit us today. Are we benefiting from them? Absolutely. Are we in some way contributing to them, and by doing that perpetuating them? Sure, to a certain degree we are.
We try to actively not.
But it's hard
to when that's the system.
Right. And when things benefit us, it's very hard to turn around and say, no, I don't want to do this thing. It doesn't benefit me.
Yeah.
Or it benefits me, and so I don't want it. It's hard to actively refute that. But blaming men today in 2023 for the system that created it is a problem. And I think that this is where toxic masculinity falls flat for me. Sure, you've got these characters on social media or in popular pop culture that are like just not good role models for what masculinity should be. But to then paint the entire gender of males as toxic because of these traits that we hyperinflate to being bad because of a certain subset of males that have them, that seems like a problem to me.
Yeah, and so you raised the question of whether WebMD had a toxic femininity page, and the answer is no. So then how would you define toxic femininity? And the way I would define it is blindly labeling all men as toxic. Blindly saying toxic masculinity is the problem in this world. Everything falls on the square shoulders of men. The 32-year-old, it's his fault. He's not making the system any better. You know, that to me would be what toxic femininity would be, is this blind hatred of the world that was created not by us, not by the people that live in it today, but it's this, you know, woe is me, and woe is me is not a great way of saying it, but woe is me, the world is always trying to push me down, and it's that person's fault. When neither of us or any man living in this current generation really had much to do with anything of creating the systems in place that have limited women in the ways that they've limited them.
So I think the problem is actually, I don't like the idea that we're creating some sort of a binary black and white oppositional thing. So when we say toxic masculinity, we're implying that certain traits, masculine traits, are bad. When in fact, what I think we're actually trying to suggest, at least the way that I understand toxic masculinity, is certain traits are taken to an extreme to the point that they become toxic, right? We both love to eat. Is eating a bad thing? Certainly not. Is eating too much a bad thing? Absolutely, right? And so it's concepts around moderation, around balance. Yeah. And so I hate this idea of taking one thing, labeling it as toxic, and then attributing to everything else, because it becomes so oppositional, it becomes so binary, it becomes so black and white. And I think, you know, and I think we've talked about this in a previous episode, but the minute that we try to create some sort of a binary distinction between things, that's when we force people to be with us or against us, when in reality, everything that we have in life exists in a gray area.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. And I think another way to put it is just being open to new ideas, being open to conversation, being open to opposition. Because every great opportunity of growth in life comes from somebody or something challenging what you thought to be the norm. Right? So if we swing this back around to the comment that we had, it was this idea of, I didn't know this person, you didn't really know this person, hadn't spoken to this person, yet whatever had happened in her life, there was no point in her mind that she, like, I'm imagining there's no point in her mind where she, before hitting send on this comment, said, well, maybe I should message Matt and Carlo and get an idea of who they are before I lump them in with the men are trash comment.
Right.
Right? It's just like on the flip side of the coin, going back to my idea of the mechanic example. You know, we could say there's no such thing as a good female mechanic, or we could say, well, let me talk to this lady and figure out if she knows anything about cars before I label her as a bad or a good mechanic. You have to be open to learning what you don't know before you can form an opinion. And every sort of toxicity and prejudice comes from this idea of, because these two people share some sort of familiarity, they must be the same.
Yep.
And that's a greater, bigger, giant problem that the world has that doesn't just narrow in on gender.
Yep.
But it's just, I know it can be hard to get past that. I know it can be hard to, especially when you've been burned, to try and label somebody that shares a familiarity with the person that burned you, try to separate them out. But if you can't, you will hinder your own life.
Yeah.
Right? So again, if we look at it at the idea of all men are trash, well, if you are a heterosexual female looking for a male partner and you want to label all men as trash, you will never find a good male partner, because a good man would never put up with, you and I'm going to speak for you here, would never put up with a woman that treated us poorly because she felt we were lesser than due to our gender.
Sure. I agree.
So she would be limiting her own prospects, her own ability to find a good partner and a good mate, if that's what she was looking for, just due to that prejudice. Right? So this whole act of, you look at these people that are very blatantly toxically masculine, and then you have to look at the flip side of the coin. What are they losing out in life because they've chosen to live that way? Mm-hmm. Think of all the amazing conversations and friendships you could have with a woman talking about all sorts of amazing things if you were willing to believe that that woman was just as capable as you are. Right? So to me, it saddens me that we live in this world of toxic anything, but it saddens me even more for the people that aren't willing to open up to new ideas and having their minds changed, because you are hurting yourself more than you are actually hurting that person with a comment.
Yes. I'm going to introduce a concept as I'm thinking about it. And talking about toxicity, talking about what traits aren't toxic and how we think about them. I think for me, one of the most damaging things in our society today is toxic polarity. You talked just now about people aren't taking the time to learn. They're not taking the time to ask questions, to gain context, right? And we're jumping to these conclusions. Now, the art of jumping to a conclusion is something that our brain does to try to make us more efficient, right? Our brain creates shortcuts. It says, I see this thing in front of me. I've seen something like it before. I'm going to save myself time by assuming I know A, B, and C about it. These are called biases. Everybody does them. We do them all the time. The fast way to find out who is an ignorant person is a person if they say they're not biased at all, right? And so biases are a human tendency that we all share, where we're trying to cut corners in our brain to be more efficient and go A, B, and C faster. Here's what happens. The minute that we do that, we create these buckets and we lump people, places, things, cultures, genders, sexualities into these buckets where we think we know a thing about this group of people. This is what a stereotype is. And as soon as that happens, we start to create this polarity where it's either a yes or no, A or B, black or white. And the minute that we let ourselves think of things as black and white. We're not looking for a gray area. We're not looking for context or new knowledge or things that are going to challenge the biases that we hold. And that to me is toxic polarity. And I want to do some more work on this now, because this is just coming to me as we're talking, as we're recording. But this to me is the biggest issue that we are facing, certainly in Western society, if not other places around the world, is this deep desire to be able to lump some things to make it easier for our brains to process.
Yeah. So this is kind of interesting to me, because I think there's so many things that have happened over the last few years that have been, in my opinion, would fall under the category of toxic polarity that you've talked about here, right? We look at the stances that a lot of people took on COVID and vaccination.
Sure.
We look at how people are looking at the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. We look at how people are handling like politics. Politics, in my opinion, is the most dramatized media show of anything.
Oh yeah.
Right?
If you would have told me 5 years ago that I could sit down and watch a question period in either like the Canadian House of Commons or the US House of Representatives, I would have thought that I was out of my mind. But nope, this is something that I do now.
And it's not something that I would say I sit down and I watch, but I do see them. And the most infuriating thing for me is that nobody legitimately answers a question, right? Yeah. So if you aren't familiar, if you've never seen like a House of Commons or a political debate, a lot of these questions are, here's my question for you. And the response back is not, here's my answer. The response back is, look at this other great thing I've done that is completely unrelated. Or look at how I've spun what you've asked me to lead into what I want to talk about.
Or let me just flat out challenge the premise of your question and debunk why that should even be a question to begin with.
Yeah. So because of this back and forth and unwillingness to open your mind to the other side of the argument, right? Because if politics was, hey, how come you spent $100,000 of taxpayer money on a dinner? If the response was, interesting, where did you come to the numbers that I spent $100,000 on dinner? How did you not, how come, because I spent that dinner on this, and this, please tell me how you came to that conclusion. We might actually get somewhere.
Yep.
But it isn't. It's, well, look at this great thing that I've done for oil and gas. It's like, cool, that doesn't answer my question about how you spent $100,000 on a dinner, right? So it's this unwillingness over and over again to just be open to a constructive conversation, this unwillingness to be open to any new idea. So let me ask you this. Imagine you're a person listening to this podcast or out in life, and you've been presented with an idea that challenges a core prejudice that you have, a core bias. Mm-hmm. But you are smart enough to acknowledge the fact that it has now challenged an idea that you hold true. But you're intrigued enough by the challenge that you want to start learning more about the other argument.
Yep.
You following me?
Yep.
How do you start? How do you start overcoming this bias that you have, this toxic prejudice that you have, to start learning about the other side?
Great question, and because I think about this a lot and I talk about this a lot in some of the workshops that I facilitate. There's three things. The first one is, and this is the most important, and it's kind of an umbrella for the other two that I'm about to share. You have to commit to being curious. You have to commit to being curious. As adults, we have this annoying tendency to think we know it all.
Sure.
Right? And again, it's that whole thing that I explained a few minutes ago. But if and when we as human beings commit to being curious, then it puts us in the mindset to be receptive to new information. So that's the first thing. And then the umbrella things that fall underneath that is, first one is, is do the research. And when you're researching, like I understand that most of us that are not in an academic capacity, search engines are our best friend. I'm not going to say the specific search engine so that the one behind me doesn't think it's a part of the conversation. But use your go-to search engine and check things out. But here's the trick. We can't simply look for things that confirm what we already think we know. And confirmation bias is so huge that, you know, it's to the point where I guarantee you that every single one of your Instagram algorithms knows how you feel on any certain subject, and it's going to cater the videos and the content that you see to what it thinks it knows about you. So you have to commit to being curious in the way that you approach the information that you consume. I'll give you an example. Typically, my social media tends to be, if you're talking about politics, more politically left in air quotations, right? A little bit more socially progressive. This tends to be my social media outlets. I then turn around and whenever I can, I listen to AM talk show radio, which based on where we are located in the province of Alberta, AM talk show radio tends to have quite a conservative leaning slant to it. And that is my desire to be curious. It's opening myself up to different sources of information to be able to create a more well-rounded sense of these things. So that's thing 2. Be curious, seek out diverse sources of information. And the third one is find someone, a real live human being who believes this thing that is contradictory to what you hold, and talk to them.
Yeah.
Because when we have ideas that we see and we experience, it's easy to hold contempt for an idea or a concept like, oh, those anti-vaxxers or whatever it is. But when you go and find somebody in your life who has chosen not to, again, take the vaccine as an example, that humanizes the issue. And that's what the first step is in towards having that constructive dialogue that you talked about, is we have to be willing to put ourselves into a conversation to better understand those things. Yeah. So 3 things to answer your question: be curious, seek diverse sets of information, and have a conversation with someone who believes something different.
I love all 3 of those things. And the way I would answer my own question would be very similar. But I would add one step before that. Because all of those things are amazing, but they cannot happen until you understand that you need to disjoint the person from the idea.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
So if you meet a person and you dislike one of their ideas, you have to acknowledge the fact that you can still converse with, be kind to, and enjoy the company of that person, even if you don't enjoy their idea or opinion.
Yes.
Because that is how you will have that conversation with that person. That is how you will be open to the new idea. That is what will spark the intrigue in letting you go do the research. It is also the opposing argument that you can now be exposed to. But if you cannot separate the person from the opinion, then all you will ever see is your bias of the opinion.
I love that.
Right?
I think that's the mic drop that we start to bring things to a close on here.
Yeah, I like it. I think that this conversation, it branched, right? Like we wanted to talk about, masculine toxicity. And I think we did, but I think it opened up this broader umbrella of just being closed-minded and being, unwilling to open yourself up to new ideas. And I think for me, the scariest part about this is I think about all of the people that are out there for whatever reason that have formed these biases, that they are missing out. They are missing out because having a good, genuine debate, not an argument, not a fight, but a debate with someone is a lot of fun, right? And you learn so much from it and you get these outside perspectives and it opens you up to so many new things. So to me, if I were to say, there's one thing that I would really want people to take away from our episode, it would be just, like you said, be open to the new idea, right? And you'll be surprised by how much you benefit from it.
Yeah, I completely second that. I think that if we show that willingness to learn, to not take for granted the idea that what's happening today might be different than what happened yesterday, we open ourselves up to a whole lot of beautiful opportunities for learning. We open ourselves up to being vulnerable too, in a lot of ways, and that's the reason why people end up being so closed off. It's a protection mechanism. But beautiful, beautiful things can happen when we're willing to learn, be curious, and open ourselves up in the way that you're describing to all new sorts of people and knowledge and things.
Love it. So I guess my question for you guys would be maybe two things. We'd love to have some input from you guys. One, can you share an example of a time that you were faced with a bias or faced with an opinion that you thought to be true, and you found out after that maybe you were able to form a different opinion, right? Because we've all had that, I would hope, in our lives, an opportunity to be proven slightly wrong.
Yeah.
Right? And it was for the better, right? So share an example of that with us.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing is what is that little spark? What is that idea that you've been exposed to recently that is you're now just starting to get into wanting to know more about the other side? Because I don't know about you, but I always have like 100 different things that it's like, that's a new piece of information I didn't know about. I need to know more about it.
What's the For Dummies book that you would like to read right now?
Love it. What's the For Dummies book? Yeah. I think that this has been a really cool conversation. Is there anything that you think you would want to add to this topic? Like, I'm sure we'll explore it more. But is there any final thought that you would want to add to it?
Of all the things that we have talked about so far on this podcast, this is the one of the ones that I feel the most passionate about because it influences everything.
So much.
Everything. So if there's anybody who listens to this episode and you have thoughts, you're passionate about this in some way, please reach out.
Yeah.
I love nothing more than to have conversations about this with humans.
Yeah. And
that's something that I really value and really would love to be able to do more with you.
Yeah, and I in a little bit of shameless self-promotion, if you have somebody in your life that is a little bit more headstrong in like kind of their opinions, I would love to know what their opinion of this episode is. Right? Because some people, like, we all know that person that is very, very like, this is how I like it, this is the way I do it, nobody's going to change my mind. So I would be interested in knowing, like, hey, if they listen to this episode, do any of our points make sense? Or are we just a bunch of crazy liberal millennial kids that have, pie in the sky hopes for the world? So, yeah. All right, guys, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of the Men and Community Podcast. This one has been a lot of fun. I think it was a great conversation. Weigh in. Give us your peace of mind. Tell us if we're crazy. Tell us if we're right. Tell us if you think we've completely missed the mark. Share us with your friends. If you could please leave us a like, a rating, a little bit of an encouragement, word, criticism, something. Engage with us because we want to have these conversations with you guys. The feedback we continue to gather from the community has been just uplifting and inspiring, and we're so happy to have you guys as part of our community. Matt, I want to say today that I think one of the things that I'm very grateful for about you, because we can't miss this part. I've been told, actually, a friend of mine said this is the favorite part of her episode.
I love it.
Yeah. I'm just grateful for the level of education and the level of smarts that you bring when in whatever you're doing. right? Like you're a well-educated man, but I don't feel that you've ever held that above anybody that isn't. Mm-hmm. And you are always open in sharing everything through the lens of personal experience and emotion. It's not a clinical education, it's a life education that you bring. And I appreciate that whenever we speak, you bring that kind of knowledge into our conversations.
Thank you. I'm feeling really grateful, and I appreciate this about you all the time, but especially after this conversation, how you find this beautiful way of making everything about the person. Mm-hmm. You bring everything back to a human level, to a human perspective. Every big, scary, audacious thing that we talk about, you bring it back to the person, to the human being. And I think that's so valuable, and it's something that I really appreciate and value. And it shows up in the way that you hold yourself in the relationships, the friendships, the communities that you have. So thank you.
Thank you.
And to summarize, Carlo, we hope that you can engage with us and provide us with peace of mind, or give us a piece of your mind. Either way, we're very, very happy to have it.
And with that soundbite, guys, thank you. We'll see you next time. Bye.